Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm somewhat rested after our marathon live stream last night. Aaron Bastani, how are you feeling? A little bit worse for wear?
Worse for wear is probably a good way to describe it, Michael. I'm so tired. I was just looking at myself in the camera. One of my eyes is somewhat smaller than the other. That's when you know. That's when you know you're really tired. One of the eyes starts to shrink. But for good reason, really interesting election. So I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation. It's a must watch.
You would have had us going for longer last night as well. When I said it's coming up to 5, we might wrap up. Aaron was like, "What? But Waveney Valley still hasn't announced." And it came through in my ear that there was going to be a revolt in the mixing room. So luckily we did get to go home. Labour has won a landslide majority of 170 seats, and Britain has a new Prime Minister.
One of the great strengths of this nation has always been our ability to navigate a way to calmer waters. And yet this depends upon politicians, particularly those who stand for stability and moderation, as I do, recognizing when we must change course. For too long now, we've turned a blind eye as millions slid into greater insecurity. Nurses, builders, drivers, carers, people doing the right thing, working harder every day, recognized at moments like this before, yet as soon as the cameras stop rolling, their lives are ignored. I want to say very clearly to those people, not this time. Changing a country is not like flicking a switch. The world is now a more volatile place. This will take a while. But have no doubt that the work of change begins immediately.
He seems like he's been practicing that for a while, hasn't he? People always said he looked prime ministerial. He did look fairly prime ministerial there, didn't he? So the first time in a while, I think we've had someone speak outside Downing Street where you couldn't hear Steve Bray, the Stop Brexit man, sort of playing some kind of comedy music in the background, which is maybe why it seemed a bit more, it seemed more of an occasion than sometimes when we saw the Tory prime ministers come out. Keir Starmer sort of stressed moderation, and I think there he was sort of trying to stress delivery. He was saying, I'm not going to be all talk. People have come out here and said, we'll level up or we'll tackle the great injustices. That was Theresa May, wasn't it? But no one did anything. Judge me on my record. Keir Starmer also, the first thing you do when you become Prime Minister, appointed his cabinet. As far as I understand, no surprises there. Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor. Most of the shadow ministers have ended up just being given their jobs. So they were the shadow minister for health. Now they're the health minister. The only big changes, I suppose, are the people who lost their seats. So I know that Fangam Debonair, who lost her seat, she was shadow culture secretary. Lisa Nandy now has that job. Aaron, we'll get on to a proper analysis of the results in a moment and what happened last night. First off, what are you made of Keir Starmer's first moves as Prime Minister? What happened today, essentially?
Quite boring. Non-entity, no surprises. No, but you want that, right? You don't want to upset people and drama. I know that's been the default of British politics for the last 8 years, but you want your first day to be quite stable and you want to operationalize plans which have been long in the making. So very calm. Obviously, the one thing that probably wasn't expected on their side was that Fangam Debonair would have been the Secretary of State for Culture, Sport, Media. She's obviously not there. We'll talk about that more later, I presume. But other than that, absolutely none of the picks are surprising. I would say, though, it's really gratifying for me to see Angela Rayner be in charge of a brief which includes housing when she is somebody who has used social housing. We need more politicians like that. We need more people in power with that kind of backstory and experience.
Bridget Phillipson, who I've never particularly warmed to as a politician or a speaker. She will be the first education secretary who was herself on free school meals. So sort of regardless, I suppose, of what you think of the politics of the person, that does seem like a positive sign. Let's talk about the results. The result of this election ended up being actually more strange than anyone had really expected. Now, that's because while Labour won a landslide majority, they also suffered some significant defeats. This doesn't usually happen. In Bristol, Shadow Culture Secretary Fangham Debonair lost to the Greens' Carla Denyer. In Leicester, Shadow Work and Pension Secretary Jonathan Ashworth lost to a pro-Gaza independent candidate. And in Islington North, Labour were thrashed by Jeremy Corbyn.
This result is, to me, a resounding message from the people of Islington North that they want something different, they want something better, and in the new government that's coming in, they're looking for an end to things like the two-child benefit policy cap. They're looking for regulation of the private rented sector. And if I may say so, they're also looking for a government that on the world stage will search for peace, not war, and not allow the terrible conditions to go on that are happening in Gaza at the present time.
So in total, if you include Corbyn in the figure, Labour lost 5 seats to independent candidates with a stronger position on Gaza than Keir Starmer. And they could have lost more. Wes Streeting won his seat with only 528 more votes than the British Palestinian candidate Liane Mohammed, who came in second. Wes Streeting, sort of pipped to be the future leader of the Labour Party, could have lost his seat to a pro-Palestine candidate. Meanwhile, in Bethnal Green and Bow, Rushanala Ali went from a majority of 38,000, so one of the biggest majorities in the country, to one of just 1,500. So it's sort of an enormous swing away from a Labour politician on a night when Labour got a landslide. And these individual setbacks also spoke to a broader sense of insecurity about Labour's overall support. The party won its comfortable majority on under 34% of the national vote, and with only an increase of 1.6 percentage points on the 2019 result. And as John Curtis explained, the picture outside Scotland is even more striking.
For the rise of the Labour Party in Scotland, which has been truly spectacular, we will be reporting that basically Labour's vote has not changed from what it was in 2019. In Wales, it's actually down, and England, it is barely changed. One has to say, this does look like an election that the Conservatives have lost, and have lost primarily because of the votes they have lost to Reform, which has cost the party seat after seat after seat. Around 2/3 of the seats that the Conservatives have lost are seats where if Reform voters had voted Conservative, they would still have hung on to.
So Labour have won a stumping majority, not because they massively increased their support, but because their opponents were divided. And they also won their seats efficiently. Now, that means not piling up votes in safe constituencies, but rather winning just enough in each seat to maximise overall wins. So you're sort of spreading out your support very efficiently. Now, that has clearly been very effective in this instance. That's why Labour have this massive majority. It also means that that majority is somewhat vulnerable, though. This chart from The Times shows the winning margin in each seat in the last 3 general elections. As you can see, in both 2019 and 2017, there were a lot of seats with massive majorities, running up to over 40,000 in the case of Labour. In 2024, however, the vast majority of seats have majorities of under 10,000. Now, according to The Times, the average seat majority in 2024 is 6,700. That compares to an average seat majority of 11,200 in 2019. Aaron, so much going on here. Obviously, you've got the story about Gaza with these independents, but the broader story seems to just be that Labour, they've done well. The plan has worked. They've got a massive majority, but really on not a very impressive vote share at all. As we're going to speak about in a moment, turnout was down. Does it make any sense to sort of talk about a party with a 170-seat majority as being vulnerable?
Yes, because they are vulnerable. You know, the next election, that majority could actually disappear. That's easier said than done. But often when people get a big majority, and I don't mean like 2019 with the Tories, this is a very big majority. This is on a par, slightly smaller than Blair in 97. That generally takes more than one election to wind down. The next parliament could be a hung parliament. I mean, it seems very unlikely. You'd need lots of strange things to happen, but it's quite plausible. One thing I would push back on, though, Michael, and how dare I do this against the great John Curtis, is that this idea that Reform voters would have otherwise voted Tory, I just don't think that's true. You know, my experience of speaking to Reform voters is, yes, many of them are 2019 Tory voters. That's absolutely the case. 3/4 of them, I think that's what the data suggests. And the Tories need to get those people back if they want to win, absolutely. But the idea they would have voted Conservative if Reform hadn't, stood a good campaign simply isn't true. They just wouldn't have voted, I think. And that's the experience I saw here in Portsmouth. In Portsmouth North, Labour won, Penny Mordaunt lost. Reform, they did quite well. I know many people who voted Reform. I know of many people who voted Reform. And they weren't people who otherwise would have voted Conservative. They had, for the most part, turned off from the Conservative Party. So look, that's obviously contributed to the scale of the majority. But this idea that, oh no, if only Reform hadn't stood, the Tory vote would have been very healthy. Yeah, you know what? Maybe like a third to a half of those votes would have gone with the Tories. But actually, many people otherwise wouldn't have voted. Or they might have voted for an independent, or maybe even some would have voted Labour. But this idea that, you just need to get those people back and it's all right. No. The Conservatives had very big problems with turning out their vote, whether or not Reform stood, whether or not Nigel Farage and his band of merry men won 5 seats, which is what has happened.
The result could speak in a couple of ways to potential problems regarding the legitimacy of our democracy. So first, the turnout was absolutely atrocious. So it was 60%. This was the second lowest turnout since 1885. It was only lower in 2001 when it was 59%. So it's basically, the same as that. Very, very low. And this is supposed to be a big change election. Second, the result is more disproportionate than ever. So Labour won a stomping majority on the lowest vote share of any post-war single-party government. So any party that went on to form a single-party government, so not a coalition, Labour have the lowest vote share of compared to all 3 wins of Tony Blair, compared to the Conservatives in 2015 and 2019. And you might imagine that supporters of other parties could feel justified in feeling a bit aggrieved. This is the breakdown of vote share versus seat share. So Labour on a third of the vote won 2/3 of their seats. It's somewhat proportionate when it comes to the Conservatives. So they won 24% of the vote and got 19% of the seats. It's most disproportionate when it comes to Reform, who got 14% of the vote and 1% of the seats. The Lib Dems, theirs was fairly proportionate this time around, 12% of the vote, 11% of the seats. The Green Party on 7% of the vote and 1% of the seats. Until sort of a couple of hours ago, it did look as if Reform and the Greens had won the same number of seats. Reform actually in the last couple of hours won their 5th seat because they won the freeway contest in Basildon and Billericay between the Conservatives, Labour and themselves. Aaron, I saw today sort of Nigel Farage in his sort of big press conference sort of saying he is going to be, fighting really strongly for electoral reform at this, in the next parliament, I suppose. He said he'll stand with anyone who's willing to campaign with him on it. My general assumption, I'm a big supporter of electoral reform. My general assumption is that there are very high barriers to achieving it, and no major party is, well, the two major parties have no interest in it, but at the same time, I think it's going to be difficult for anyone to win many seats on a constitutional question of this sort. It's quite nerdy. So even with, a campaigner like Nigel Farage alongside the Green Party now with 4 MPs, I think the unfairness of the system is obvious to people. Can it be changed? I'm still skeptical, even if I would like it to be changed, of course.
Well, I mean, it can be changed because, of course, many countries have PR. They didn't. These countries didn't emerge from the womb with PR. So obviously, people have changed electoral systems and they've become democracies and they've tried different things. Italy, I think, has had several electoral systems over the last 15 years. I think you're right, though. Of course, particularly Labour don't stand to benefit from PR right now. What I would say, though, is, Michael, the Liberal Democrats have had their best election, if you include the Liberals, of course, since 1923. So that's really significant that you're going to have a party of that size supporting PR. Of course, you have the Greens, you have Reform too. Here's the big thing, though, and it's not going to change from what we can see right now. First past the post creates relatively fair outcomes when you have 2 parties. However, in terms of the largest 2 parties and the share of the vote they got yesterday, below 60%, I believe. We can check that. We need to double check that. I'm a bit tired. But it's the lowest it's been since 1918. And the problem is, Michael, once the two largest parties get that smaller vote share, clearly it's the majority of the vote share, but it's not where it should be. Um, then you start to create all kinds of weird outcomes. And if that's the new normal of British politics, you've got the Liberal Democrats, you've got the SNP, you've got Reform, you've got the Greens, and I don't think those parties are disappearing anytime soon. I think in all likelihood, Reform and the Greens will win more seats at the next election. Then it's going to continue to throw out really strange results. And I think in this instance, with a big majority, I agree with you. But as soon as we have this long-term pattern of the big two not having that large share, and we get a hung parliament with parties that want PR, I'm thinking the Lib Dems, the Green Party, Reform, then I think it does change things somewhat. Look, also, if you look at the number of MPs and the vote share of Reform and the Greens put together, so I think between them, more than 20% of the vote went to the Green Party and to Reform. They got 9 MPs on 20% of the vote. Not remotely fair or just. And here's the irony. I think if we had PR, we would have probably had in this election a traffic light coalition. Labour, Lib Dems, Green, somewhat like what they had in Germany, although don't hold that against me in terms of political judgment because that government's been awful. But actually, the politics of that wouldn't be so radically different from Keir Starmer's offer in this election. Slightly more left, perhaps, but not radically. But it would have a lot more buy-in and consent. And importantly, Michael, what PR does for me is it provides stability because you don't have massive majority for this party 1 minute, massive majority for that party the next minute. You can actually have people saying, we want to govern, solve these problems, address these challenges over a 10, 20, 30 year time frame. And I know you're saying about it being wonky, but I actually think the electorate really likes that, Michael. And if that argument can be made and we get a hung parliament in the next parliament or two, given that trend I've spoken about with regards to the large two parties shrinking in terms of the overall share of the vote, then I think we can get PR. I don't think it's likely in the next 5, 10 years, but I think it's very possible. I think if you believe in it as a system, you should be campaigning and arguing for it. I certainly plan to.
Nigel Farage has already won a massive constitutional change in this country, which is leaving the European Union. People would have at one point said that was somewhat wonky. It was a marginal position, actually, for a very long time, leaving the European Union. I suppose that could be tied to this incredibly emotive issue of immigration. Whereas, I don't know, do you think to sort of win PR, because I suppose the ideal campaign sort of spans all the different smaller parties and it sort of, can bring on board left-wingers and right-wingers who just want a fair voting system. But at the same time, I don't think Brexit would have been won if it was purely about the sovereignty of Parliament. You needed this non-constitutional issue, which was immigration, to get it sort of over the line. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that immigration should be the issue, but I can't think what would be the issue that you tag along to a PR campaign to make it more than a kind of wonky constitutional topic. This is not to denigrate it. I think it would be really important. I'm just saying I think it's difficult to make that a high salience issue for the general public who don't follow politics in the same obsessive way that we do.
I don't think it's about obsessive. I think most people know their votes don't count and that kind of matters. And I think if you can talk about a democratic deficit and ineffective government, then I think that does matter. Look, if Labour solve a bunch of problems, Michael, in the next 5 years, and the country is doing really well, living standards start to improve, housing crisis addressed, generally speaking, the public has greater faith in democracy and politics in 5 years' time than today. I agree with you. It's very hard to make the argument for PR. However, if we carry on in the next 5 years like the last 5 years, my view is things may improve 5%. By the way, that's not nothing, right? Stopping the rot and slightly improving some things is not nothing. I think there's still a very strong argument for it. And there's a catch-22 here, isn't there? Because ironically, if you have, say, like UKIP did in 2015, they got 1 MP, and I think they got, 4 million votes? Actually, they got almost as many votes as they did today, which I think kind of speaks to Reform underachieving, strangely enough. We can talk about that more later, perhaps. But, 3.9 million votes, I think, for UKIP in 2015. 1 MP, that's actually when people are going to be most activated for caring about this. Oh my God, what an outrage. Problem is, the outrage is inversely correlated to how many MPs you've got. And of course, the fewer MPs you've got, the less you can do about it. So it is a bit of a strange one, Michael. I do agree with you, but I think I challenge you on this. It can be an emotive issue because people want effective government and people want democracy and take back control, sovereignty, democratic governance arguments. And I think the same can be said with regards to PR.
Let's go to a few super chats. Lil God, nothing will change under these red rosette Tories. The left needs to collaborate and take down the rising far right we see taking shape. Just my 2p. That reminds me, I have to say, I definitely wasn't critical of it, but I wasn't entirely sort of, I suppose, emotionally bought in to, Owen Jones sort of like, we deserve better, Labour are going to win a majority, so campaign for Greens, campaign for independence. My sort of sense was a bit like, now's not really, people really want to get rid of the Conservatives. That is going to be sort of overwhelming, just sort of this feeling that we want rid of the Conservatives, so we're going to vote Labour. I thought that if there was going to be a sort of moment for third parties and for independence, it would probably be in 5 years' time. I mean, these results have basically proven me wrong. And, one person who I think, comes out looking very good from these results in terms of the strategy they've had over the past few weeks and the outcome is Owen Jones, right? He said over and over again, Labour are going to win a massive majority, keep them on their toes by voting for independents and Greens. Obviously, the issue he put front and centre over the past few weeks, past few months, has been Palestine. And, there were lots of people sort of on Twitter saying, oh, Owen Jones is going to be crying when Corbyn loses and Labour win this massive majority. He seems to be pretty vindicated in this general election, no?
100%, Michael. Look, I think this is a very interesting and positive set of results for the left, both inside the Labour Party, and of course there are still some people on the left inside Labour, but also beyond it. Personally, I think if Wes Streeting had lost, only 500 votes away from that happening, I think this would have been an incredible set of results for the left. And I think if he had lost to Liane Mohammed on the back of Gaza, Michael, every single Labour MP would say to themselves, their partners, their best friends, their political colleagues, I cannot muck about on this issue. I cannot take that free junket from LFI to Tel Aviv. I cannot both sides war crimes because I could lose my seat. Don't forget what happened to Wes Streeting. Now, I know John Ashworth has lost his seat, but I think Wes Streeting would have been a much higher scalp. I mean, this guy's a potential, future leader of the Labour Party. Isn't it ironic, by the way? Everybody in the media says that Wes Streeting is such a talented politician. He's a future leader. Nobody's got a bad word to say about him. He almost lost his seat. It was 500 votes away. The people that make the decisions and ultimately have power in this country are the voters. It's not several hundred journalists inside the M25. It's not LBC call-in studio producers and hosts. And it's not Laura Kuenssberg. And I think that's a useful reminder, by the way. MPs only work that out every 4 to 5 years. They can sometimes forget in between. But I think a big scalp like Streeting would have been the icing on the cake. But I agree with you. It's a very good set of results for the left in a very strange way. And it vindicates, actually, this idea that, no, the big legacy parties can't just bully people when they want. And yes, foreign policy does matter. And yes, if you have a strong local political brand, actually, you won't get bulldozed by the permanent political class in Westminster. So I think that's right. Owen is very much vindicated. I think he's been supremely vindicated. Many people, by the way, in the Green Party were saying to me ahead of this election, we can get 4 seats here. And they were like, look, the canvassing returns look very positive. And actually, they could have got more than 4 seats, couldn't they? We'll talk about that more later. But, Carla Denyer got more than a 10,000 majority. This actually could, this is a very good sort of set of circumstances for people like Owen. But there's a world out there where the Greens get 5, maybe even 6 MPs. They certainly could have got 5 with another one in Bristol. And Jess Phillips and Wes Streeting lose their seats. This is margin of error stuff, right? And I think the whole political conversation then between the left and between the Labour Party, the relationship between the left outside the Labour Party and Keir Starmer looks very different.
And John Ashworth, there is a sort of certain delight in John Ashworth losing his seat because he was the person who sort of just days before the election had sort of been bragging about sending Bangladeshis back. Not Bangladeshis with British citizens, but Bangladeshis who are here without papers, let's say, saying we need to start deporting them more quickly. He's an MP in a seat with a large South Asian population, so I don't really know what he was thinking. And I think that kind of sort of complacency we might not be seeing much more of. I do want to. So I think it's sort of worth actually rebutting this or addressing it because there has been a sort of meme online and especially among the right that this is the British politics becoming deeply sectarian. I'm going to go to read out this tweet actually. It's by a guy called Sam Ashworth Hayes. A string of independent MPs winning on Gaza is a huge flashing warning sign for the future of the country. Total utter failures of integration. Fundamentally, if the result of decades of immigration policy is finding yourself playing host to a population utterly hostile to your foreign policy and behaving as a unified bloc to overturn it, you may wish to reconsider the wisdom of said immigration policy. As a way to avoid hard conversations about integration, we've hid behind the idea that the only thing that matters is your passport, 5 years and a fee, and that's it. Integration achieved, nothing to worry about, even as handing citizen out stored up further issues. So he's a leader writer and business columnist for The Telegraph. The context here is that people have voted because they oppose to a genocide or war that our sort of government has been complicit with. For one, I think there's deep hypocrisy here, because when it was the case that sort of Jews in Britain were telling pollsters that they didn't want to vote for Labour, everyone said this is a moral stain on the Labour Party. Now you've got a situation where lots of Muslims are deciding they don't want to vote for the Labour Party. Suddenly this is people failing to integrate. This is sinister. And at the same time, I mean, the sort of Douglas Murrays of the world, the people who are sort of always trying to say having lots of immigration is going to massively shift your politics. What they're always trying to do is sort of say, oh, you as a gay person, you shouldn't be happy with an increased number of Muslims in the country because they have illiberal attitudes. And the idea is that at some point they'll start voting to ban, gay rights or gay marriage or whatever. And the only thing that actually, it seems, there has been a sort of electoral cost for when it comes to Muslim voters is giving unconditional backing to a genocide or war. Now, to me, that's not very scary. That's great. If we've got more sections in our electorate who are able to have a bit more compassion for people in different countries, and then can sort of vote to try and correct when our government is, so dramatically trampling over the rights of people in different countries, I think that's fine. By the way, I also think it's fine that there's Jewish voters in the country who want, our government to be closer to the Israeli government. That's fine. That's democracy. But to sort of paint it as something sinister, Aaron, how would you respond to that?
It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. It was apparently a legitimate point of discussion for years in this country that Jewish voters can't vote for Labour because of their position on anti-Semitism in Israel, Palestine, but look, it's a foreign policy question, by the way, to say that Israel, shouldn't exist. There's not an opinion one way or the other. But if somebody's saying Israel is presently constituted within its present parameters, I don't agree with it. It should be a single state encompassing all the people that live in Gaza, in the West Bank, in present-day Israel. They should all be living in a single state where you have equality under the law for all, single citizenship. You can agree or disagree, whatever. That's a political position with regards to foreign policy. Okay? And basically, you had people saying, well, that's racist, that's outrageous. And if you think that, or if, by the way, you think that there's a two-state solution is viable as well, if you think that, you can have a justified opinion on the two-state solution without being Jewish in this country, by the way, some people think that, then that's also outrageous. So we had, for a very long time, and by the way, not all British Jews have, a monolithic set of views on this. British Jews mostly think, one thing for now. It's broadly Zionist, liberal Zionism, the support for Israel. Some are very critical of Israel. Some support Israel, but are far more critical of Israel's conduct in this war than, for instance, some of the leading institutions of Jewish civil society in this country have been since last October. So, whole range of opinions. But what it was legitimate to say in the media was people that have this view on a foreign policy issue are illegitimate. They're evil. They're bad. They don't deserve representation in politics. And these people over here, they're entirely justified in what they're saying. And actually, they are monolithic, and that's good. Not just it's a thing, it's good, right? Now they're saying, Muslim voters are, and again, Muslim voters are not a monolith. They have a range of views, by the way. Muslim people or people who practice Islam, who are observant Muslims, come from, guess what? Loads of different countries. They speak loads of different languages. They're a Shia, they're a Sunni. People practice their faith in different ways. So this idea of British Muslims, it's this huge monolith. They all think the same thing. Utterly ridiculous. By the way, this is a hangover of colonialism. The idea that British Iranians, the British Iranian community, we all think the same thing. I, for instance, think that, the Iranian royal family is a dumb idea. I'm not a monarchist. I think it's utterly ridiculous that you would want to have Reza Pahlavi reintroduced as a Shah of Iran. There are many British Iranians, or some British Iranians, who disagree with that, right? Thank God we don't have some institutions saying, we are the official Iranian representatives of the British Iranian community, and this is what we all think, and if you disagree, you're a racist, or you're not really British Iranian. Thank God we don't have that. By the way, that's what British Jews have had in this country for a while now. So it is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. British Muslims care deeply about a foreign policy issue, which happens to be in Gaza. By the way, they're entirely right, in my view. There are war crimes, there are attacks on civilians, there have been attacks on aid workers, there have been illegal attacks on Israeli, Iranian diplomatic buildings in Syria. We could go on and on and on and on. They think that's unjustifiable, it's unacceptable, there should be consequences for it, whether that's stopping the sale of weapons, whether that's boycotts, whether that's sanctions, etc., etc., etc. British citizens have a view on a foreign policy issue. What's the problem? That's how it works. That's how it works. You know, the Irish American community in the 60s famously backed Kennedy. You know, was that unacceptable? This has been the story of democratic governance since forever. The idea that certain constituencies have certain things that really matter to them. And I agree with you, by the way, Michael. If the British Jewish community hate Corbyn or whatever, that's up to them. And they don't universally, as I've already said. The idea that that's somehow unacceptable is nonsense. And the same applies here. British Muslims care about this issue. They voted accordingly. That's literally the definition of democracy. What is the problem? But of course, these people have to complain about something. You know, Michael, the shrill perma-hysteria of right-wing journalism never ceases to surprise me. But the extent and the velocity with which it's mainstreamed by supposedly sensible people, that does repeatedly make my jaw drop. The idea that British Muslims care about this issue, they want to vote accordingly. How is that controversial or even bad? If anything, that shows faith in the democratic process, quote unquote integration, the very thing that these same people at the Telegraph, at the Times, at the Spectator repeatedly demand. So you can't protest, you can't vote. What are you meant to do if you want to change political outcomes? You tell me.
You're supposed to have the same political opinion as the leader writer of the Telegraph. And if you don't have the same political opinion as the leader writer of the Telegraph, you fail to integrate. I think that might be the sort of underlying message there. Let's talk about the Greens. The Greens having 4 MPs is a very big deal, really big deal. They've only ever had one. In one night, they quadrupled the number of MPs. They targeted 4. They won 4. The co-leader and new MP for Bristol Central was asked about their plans.
You and the other 3 Green MPs are going to push the new Labour government, but there are 4 of you, more than 400 of them. I mean, how are you going to manage that push?
Well, you can look at the incredible outsized impact that Caroline Lucas had over her 14 years as Green MP for Brighton Pavilion and imagine what we might be able to achieve now with a quadruple-sized representation, with a group of Green MPs. We can ask the questions, put forward motions, amendments through work in committees and generally through debate, through public debate, moving the Overton window. So in other words, moving the envelope of what is politically possible, putting things on the agenda and keeping up scrutiny on the Labour government. We'll support them on areas where we agree, but where we don't think they're going far enough, we won't be afraid to speak out.
I saw John Byrne-Murdoch from the Financial Times today sort of tweet that the only bet he's willing to make about the 2029 general election is the Greens will increase their vote share. And the reason he was saying, which I think is true, is Labour have to make a decision. They've got loads of marginals now. Most of their marginals in second place is Reform or the Conservatives, and that means that on issues which sort of divide their base, which is principally, say, migration, for example, they're going to be more inclined to sort of triangulate towards the Tory position than they are going to be to triangulate towards the Liberal, Urban, Green Party position, which means there'll be this massive space that the Greens can sort of occupy and say, if you think the Labour government are too right-wing, vote for us. Aaron, this is a big deal, isn't it, for the Greens?
It is. I was at the launch of the Green Party's campaign. Christ, Michael, it feels like yesterday. It was like 6 weeks ago in Bristol. I was there, and what came over immediately was the presumption that Labour will do very well. Therefore, don't worry, your vote is safe. You're not voting for the Tories. So this actually, in a way, was an ideal set of circumstances for the Greens to do really well. And that might be counterintuitive, right? You might think, well, if Labour do well, that means that the left vote or the centre-left vote is being squeezed people who might be tempted to vote Green are voting Labour, but actually it gave them permission. Although that said, you've had those two Labour-facing seats, Brighton Pavilion, which they held since 2010, and of course Bristol Central. But you've also had those two Tory seats of North Herefordshire and Waveney Valley. We'll talk about this all more in a moment. But Labour doing so well and Tory collapse, this was an ideal set of circumstances, actually, for them to get those 4 seats. Now, you might be thinking 4 seats, big deal. A Twix bar, a Kit Kat rather, has 4 fingers. That's how many MPs. If you have a Kit Kat, you can give 1 finger to each Green MP. Big deal. You can get them all in an Uber. You can put them all in a telephone box, as the metaphor goes. But look, they've quadrupled their number of MPs overnight. And in terms of things like short money, the kind of resources you get, literally as an organisation, they don't have big money, the Green Party. That's really significant. All of a sudden, they can quadruple their parliamentary staffers, right? That's jobs for your people, your press people, your policy people. It means that you're going to get a hell of a lot more media. So I think it's really promising for the Greens. And I spoke to Chris Williams, who was their head of field campaigning. I wrote an article about their strategy, really. Just before the election, we managed to finally get that piece out, which I'm very happy about. It was rushed because, of course, everything's been rushed the last 6 weeks. And what's been really interesting for me, Michael, has been seeing we've had these 2 ideal types of campaigning, really, with Reform and with the Green Party. Green Party, face-to-face, slow and steady, thick offline connections, village fate, versus Reform, which is really a kind of mediatized, hyper leadership party of Farage, broadcast in 4K, pseudo celebrity versus village fate. You've had these 2 ideal types of campaigning, and I think the Greens have come in for real stick over the years for actually staying with that plan of focusing on those 4 seats, winning those 4 seats, nailing those, and using that as a jumping off point. And they've been proven right. Chris Williams has been proven right. Now, that was his strategy. As I refer to him in the article, is this the Dominic Cummings of the eco-socialist movement? He's a very smart chap. And I think now they'll be looking to maybe push on and compete properly. I mean, they've got dozens of second places, but compete properly in 20 seats in the next election. And they can win 10 plus, which is, very, very good. All of a sudden, that looks like the Liberal Democrats in the last Parliament. And by the way, the Liberal Democrats have just gone to 70. So that really puts them on the pitch in terms of being a national party. They're halfway there. So really, really big set of elections for them.
Rishi Sunak today apologised to the nation, not just to his party. He said, "I'm sorry. Clearly, I haven't done well enough for you, and sorry about that, guys." He's resigned. Obviously, said he'll be in place until a leadership election begins. Where do you think they're going to go next? I suppose the people who've kept their seats are sort of Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman. They sort of seem to be the most high-profile Tories who seem certain to enter into a leadership race. Both quite right-wing, but sort of Suella Braverman more comfortable, more positive about Nigel Farage and inviting him into the party, whereas Kemi Badenoch's like, I'm right-wing, I'm sort of anti-woke, but I want to keep the Conservatives as a distinct thing from the Brexit Party. Where do you see that going?
Don't forget Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt just stayed on in beautiful Godalming and Ash. He kept that by 900 votes, which I was not expecting, Michael, and he shouldn't have. If you look at the national polling, you look at what happened in the rest of the south of England, he should not have kept that seat. So I think Jeremy Hunt, if he'd lost that, I think you're absolutely right. It's either Suella or Kemi Badenoch. I still think it's going to be Suella Braverman. But, Jeremy Hunt can make a pretty compelling case that I've kept this seat in our kind of affluent southern heartlands. We've lost places like Chichester. We've lost places like, by the way, they'd kept that for a century. It'd been Tory since 1924. They just lost it. They lost Bournemouth East, West, Poole. They lost Dorset South, I believe. They lost 2 seats in Worthing. They lost Hastings. These are the places where Jeremy Hunt can say, I can get them back. Okay? I can squeeze that Lib Dem Labour vote and I can get them back. I don't know if he's going to pitch himself as that candidate, but he could do. The problem for that, though, Michael, is that if we look at Reform voters, 3/4 of Reform voters have been coming from the Tories. They voted Tory in 2019. We know that. That's from all the available polling data ahead of this actual vote. People voting Reform doesn't mean they were going to vote Tory in this election, but they voted Tory in 2019. And if the Tories want to get them back, well, they've got to have a plan for that. And To me, that doesn't look like Jeremy Hunt tanking to the centre. So in a way, even though Keir Starmer, we talked about this at the top of the show, even though Keir Starmer looks vulnerable, in a way he is, strangely, because the majorities in many of these seats now are quite small. Equally, the Tories are going to have this incredibly large battle about who they are, what they stand for, and you're going to have the Tory establishment say, we need to tack to the centre. Well, that kind of looks pretty crowded, actually. You've got Keir Starmer, you've got the Lib Dems on 70 seats. So the argument will be, well, no, we need to get those reform voters back. We need to go to the right. But it's going to be very hard politically to do that because Nigel Farage is a very talented and astute politician. So we said, it could be a hung parliament in 4 or 5 years' time, which it could do. But I think that the factor which mitigates against that is this debate. And I think the Tory establishment, like I say, will want to go back to the centre. But realistically, it's hard. And I think crazy happens, which can happen. COVID, war in Ukraine, interest rates going up. That's all why, the Tory party have just calamitously lost. But unless something crazy happens, it's hard to see how going to the centre is going to get the Tories back into a majority. I mean, it might just edge them up a little bit. Who knows? But in terms of winning an election again, building a coalition that can get you into number 10, I think it has to include getting those reform voters back. And simply put, I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
I was speaking to the deputy editor of The Spectator the other day, and I sort of asked him this question about what direction it's going to go in, and he sort of said, I mean, just look at the direction of travel for Conservative parties. If you look at Europe, if you look at the Conservative parties that are doing well, you have to move towards the populist right. That's just the direction of travel, and Britain is subject to the same, sociological and political trends as elsewhere. The reason why the National Front has sort of overtaken the centre right in France, those conditions probably also apply in Britain, as they apply in Italy. As sort of we're seeing something along those. Obviously, Germany is a somewhat unique case because of its particular history. But the idea that, why wouldn't they go to the right, I suppose, would be the question. Obviously, you can put forward some reasons. They struggle to win back centrist sort of electors. But if you're looking around the world and you're a Conservative party and you're saying, oh, what should we do? The direction of travel is all in one direction, which is to the right, right?
Yeah. That analogy to France is really important. But, Suella Braverman and people like that, let's say they're Marine Le Pen, which, by the way, they're not. The historical relationship between Marine Le Pen to fascism is very clear. Her father started a party with a former member of the Waffen SS. Okay, you might not like Suella Braverman. You might think that, her politics sort of edge towards fascism. Le Pen's party literally emerges out of fascism. But what I would say is, Michael, there is the Rassemblement National of Le Pen and of Bardella, who is, their candidate for PM, Prime Minister. And there is nobody on the Tory right edging towards that kind of, populist, ultranationalist conservatism, which is doing very well across Europe. There's nobody I look at. Maybe Kemi Badenoch is it, but I don't think so. Because what you're getting with Bardella, Michael, or Giorgia Meloni, in fact, even, is you're allying all of that stuff, the cultural stuff, etc. But it is also sort of allied to, quote unquote, credible centre-right economic offer, pro-business, etc. And I don't think the Tory right's done that yet. I mean, maybe Badenoch's going to try that, but for some reason they just talk about LGBT stuff and stuff being taught in schools, which of course Meloni does that as well, Bardella does that as well. But they have a very different offer to small businesses, which again, I think Farage has completely stolen their clothing on that stuff. I think he's completely stolen their clothing. I don't think people like Badenoch, Suella Braverman have any idea anymore how to connect with small and medium-sized businesses, the backbone of the Tory vote over the last 100 years, the petty bourgeois.
We won't stay too long because I'm actually a little bit tired, I have to say. I didn't plan an incredibly long script today because I was asleep for most of the afternoon. But one thing you did mention earlier that I want to ask you about, you sort of said you think Reform have underperformed. I suppose someone might say, they got close to destroying the Conservative Party, which was their aim. They've won more seats than ever. Of course, this is the first election where they've stood as Reform, but they've won more seats than any of the party's predecessors have, and they've come third in vote share. So, in many ways, that's a pretty phenomenal result for a small upstart party. But I suppose you think compared to expectations or compared to sort of the opportunity they had, you think they've underperformed somewhat?
Well, we'll see, won't we, in 4 or 5 years' time. In 2015, UKIP get 3.8 million votes. I think today they've got 4 million votes. Farage is so much bigger now, Michael, than he was in 2015. There is GB News now, right? There's been Talk TV. Farage on TikTok has more, and by the way, TikTok doesn't matter yet. Farage has more followers on TikTok than Labour and the Tories combined. So I think to get slightly more than UKIP got in 2015 will be disappointing. Now, what was success for Reform in this election? It was winning MPs. They had one with Lee Anderson. Now they have more than one. So getting more than one was an achievement. Getting more votes than UKIP got in 2015 was an achievement. So they've cleared those hurdles, absolutely. But I do think there'll be some disappointment. And of course, Farage getting in Parliament, right? This is, I think, the 7th, 8th time of asking. He's done it. That can't be understated in terms of how important it is. But I do think, Michael, it's not every day that a party of government like the Conservatives collapse. And maybe this is just the start of their collapse, but maybe not. And you have to take your chances in politics. The Conservatives just got their lowest share of the vote and their lowest number of seats ever. And Reform have only in that context won 5 MPs. So it's good. They've cleared that hurdle, right? They've not failed, but it's the bottom end of good. It's like if the Greens got 2 MPs, right? That's good for the Greens. It's progress. You're growing, but it's not a great night. I think Reform doesn't look. If Reform had got 20 plus MPs, I think people would be saying, okay, these guys are going to replace the Conservative Party. But right now, the Conservatives, 120 MPs, it's not a million miles away from where they were in 97. Get a charismatic leader in, get some money in, a few Labour screw-ups. Okay, we're not going to be back in power anytime soon, but we're back in business and we're not dying. I think it's a very good night for Reform, and I don't think they're a flash in the pan. But I think there's a part of Farage who he might be disappointed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of comparison between if the Greens have got 2 seats is about right. Let's go through your super chats. Rosa, I've been going about my day with such happiness and a great sense of hope today. The number of independents, Greens and Plaid seats seems like the start of change and shows the power of hopeful people. Chris Hart, apart from winning 4 seats in England, the Greens came second in another 41 seats. Yet we only hear about Reform doing that on the news. It is important. I do keep seeing sort of people say the Greens better get as much coverage as Reform in the next Parliament. They definitely should get a lot more coverage than they do get. Reform did still get, double the vote share of the Greens. So it's not a complete conspiracy that we hear slightly more from Reform.
Michael, that's true. You're absolutely right to say that. But Reform raised more money in this election, Michael, than the Tory party. And I think if the Greens had the funding of Reform, my view, they would have had more MPs. So they would have more than 5 MPs. So it works both ways.
Yeah, good point. Ms. Bobby Pinn, Corbyn's story is the hope here. We must coordinate. Dan the Grappler, very happy to see 4 Green MPs. I voted Green for the first time yesterday. Lib Dems are jubilant, but they didn't win those seats. All their campaign did was remind voters they were a Tory alternative. Well, as I said actually on last night's stream, the Lib Dems, they were the only party whose candidate ended the election campaign with much higher approval ratings than they started. I suppose because people somewhat warmed to the guy. I don't think there's anything particularly deep going on there, but they're definitely going to be, for a party that had, if you're looking for a good campaign, the Lib Dems probably had, statistically, the best campaign in terms of how people thought of them at the start and how they thought of them at the end. There wasn't much change when it came to Labour or the Conservatives. Obviously, Reform had a good campaign, but that's because they had a new leader, Nigel Farage, sort of entering. It wasn't anything that they did in the campaign. The Lib Dems, it's the Lib Dem sort of election strategist who should probably get the biggest raise after this election. Tad Cantwell, I find it ironic that the UK was experimenting with PR in the early 1900s in Ireland, and now it is too much of a tradition to change. By the way, what form of PR does NM favour? I'm fairly open-minded about exactly what form. Do you have a big opinion? I suppose in terms of, so some of the options, like you've got single transferable vote, haven't you? So I think that's when you sort of have 5, you sort of have bigger constituencies, and then you sort of, each region might get about 10 MPs, and then you sort of rank them all, and it's all quite complicated. Or you can just have a list where you just vote for the list, and then or you can have a mixed system where you vote for a constituency MP and then a list. Maybe that second one is sort of the one that people are most likely to understand, where you just vote for your constituency MP and of a bigger constituency, of course, and then a party list that does the top up.
I feel like I'm doing A-level politics again, Michael.
Yeah.
With Mr. Hughes, our Welsh politics teacher, going through the system. What I would say is, Michael, that's absolutely right. Look, there are a range of options there. Personally, I prefer AMS, additional member system, which, by the way, the Brits gave the Germans after the Second World War. Funny that we created this system, which I think is a very smart system. I think they use it in Scotland too.
Scotland, Wales, and then London.
Yeah, and I think additional member system is good. So it's not purely proportional. People talk about, it's purely proportional. It's crazy. You have all kinds of crazy results. You can have the best of both. You can build in a certain bias with regards to with the Greek system, for instance. If you come top, you generally get an extra sort of 10% of the MPs or whatever. So it gives you the chance to basically get mandates and a majority. I would favour an AMS system. We can have that debate, but this idea that proportional systems never create majorities, you never have mandates, it's permanent inertia, permanent chaos. Look at the last 14 years of British government. It could be a lot better, I think.
And Borgen, Ryan, Byrne, likelihood of Corbyn joining the Greens, I would say under 25%. I'm not actually sure the Greens would want him. And I suppose the reason I say that is because the Greens are trying to build sort of quite a new identity which they want ownership of. And I suppose when they're on a high, do they want to sort of invite in this sort of older politician who is, presumably coming somewhat towards the end of their career? They're probably not going to stand more than once again in Parliament with all the baggage that brings. It also would bring a lot of support, but I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, those conversations happen, by the way. I've spoken to Zach Polanski, Deputy Leader of the Greens, about this. Those conversations happen. I think Zach personally would have been open to it. But I think you're right. Look, they don't need to, by the way. And I think this idea that you need to build this big alternative, I think in a perfect world, we would have a new left party. We'd have lots of powerful independents. We'd have a Green party doing really well. So the Green coalition they're trying to build looks quite different to this idea of a purely left-wing anti-austerity party. In many ways, it's more interesting, right? You're winning places like North Herefordshire, a Tory seat, on an agenda around conservation and, crap going into the River Wye. That to me is, you're doing God's work if you're persuading Tory voters to vote for a Green party whose manifesto includes massive investment in public services. But they're principally voting for the Green party because of conservation. They care about the environment, which, by the way, many Tory voters do, right? They might not put two and two together. I vote Tory, but it's also why there's shit in the water, or they do now. So it's a different coalition that's being built. So I don't think necessarily they all need to go together. But those conversations were happening. I would put it at less than 5% personally.
I mean, because Corbyn doesn't need to either. He's won the seat as an independent. He's a guy who likes to be free to say what he feels and means. And in a way, he's in a perfect position now. He's representing only his constituents. He doesn't have a whip. And he's got a massive personal mandate to sort of pursue the kind of campaigns and projects that he's passionate about. So yeah, I think there's probably not enough in it for either party, as in the Greens or Jeremy Corbyn to make it work.
Michael, I would say he might sit with them in Parliament. That will be really interesting, right? You're going to have these 4 Green MPs. You're going to have these independents, 5 independents. They might sit in Parliament, and by the way, and they might say on foreign policy, let's work together. 9 MPs, okay, the Labour have this massive majority, but there may be some close votes. That's not nothing.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's wrap up there. I'm going to have a long night's sleep this evening. What about you, Aaron?
I'm going to have a nice glass of wine, I think. I'm going to wash my daughter first, give her a nice bath, and then I'll have a glass of wine, have something to eat, and I think in the famous words of David Cameron, Michael, and of course the Tories were attacking Keir Starmer for wanting to wind down on a Friday night, I will chillax.
All right. If you watched our stream last night, thank you so much for spending the election with Novara Media. Thank you for tuning in tonight for our analysis after the event. We'll be back next week where we'll be analysing the first actions of Britain's new government. All very exciting. I mean, it could be more exciting, but all reasonably exciting, I think. Come back on Monday at 6 p.m. Have a great weekend. You've been watching Novara Live. Good night.